at Worlds, it's very interesting, but it happens pretty quickly. A lot of the rules changes are to align it with WFDF. And for anyone who's not familiar, that's the World Flying Disc Federation. That's who runs all of the international championship play. A lot of these rules are to get it in line with that, to make it more of seamless kind of flowing between the rule sets. Okay, does anyone else have any other questions about the sideline, involving the sideline or best perspective or anything? Okay. I'm going to do my best to quickly get through these changes and then have time to open it up for discussions and about the new rules or rules in general. Okay. They've added, these definitions. That's just, more so that when you're reading the rules, you know specifically what it means when it says a player or a sideline player or a coach. A player is defined as one of the 14 people playing on the field at a given time, whereas a sideline player is a player who could be one of those players, but they're not playing that point. They've officially changed the end zones to 20 yards. Many of you have probably only played with 20-yard end zones. It was a board motion that was put into place, but now it's codified in the rules. The same with contact. Contact was never codified in the rules officially, but many of us have probably only played with that. Unless you're old like me and Christy. So we'll get into the length of game things. They've changed a lot in how the games, how the caps work and what the caps mean. So roles, playing field, length of game. So there's no more win by 2. This follows WFDF. If a game is to 15, that's the highest it can go to. That's pretty simple. And then the new, I'd say that they've kind of simplified the caps at the end of the game. There's no more, there's a soft cap, which is very similar to how a soft cap works now. I think it used to be called like a soft time cap, but it's a soft cap is you finish the point that's being played, and then you add 1 to the highest score, and the game is now to that. And the hard cap works the same way the hard cap used to work, which is when the hard cap goes off, you finish the point that's being played. If it's not tied, the game is over. They've added a new cap that does exist in World Play called the halftime cap. So this is going to be important, especially in shorter rounds where maybe it's a very windy day. And, you've probably played in games where like maybe you don't even reach halftime, or, maybe halftime happens and the cap comes on. So halftime cap is a designated time that is halfway between the length of the game. And when that happens, if you haven't reached halftime yet, you finish the point and add 1 to the higher score, and whoever reaches that first, that becomes halftime. So hypothetically, you could still have a game with no halftime, but this would ensure that a lot more games have a halftime, and that's to make sure that teams, the whole point of a length of a game includes the fact that in the middle of that time or around, there's a 10-minute break for teams. That's very important, especially for youth scheduling, but scheduling in general, especially on very hot days. And when that's gone, then that means, if you're playing 4 or 5 games in a day, that's, between half an hour and an hour, that if you don't reach halftime, you're not getting a full half. It also prevents the weird things of there being a 5-minute second half. So does anyone have any questions on how any of the caps work now?
I just wanted to double check if like point gets scored, but then the poll doesn't go up for the following point, caps get applied after that point gets scored, right?
Yes. So once a point is scored, the next point has begun. So the length of a point is the instant that the goal is scored for the previous point, and then that point ends the instant that the goal is scored. So it's from goal scored to goal scored that's the length of a point. Pools have nothing to do with it. Nothing else has anything to do with it.
Thanks.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, could you give like a for instance or an example of how half cap would be played out? So like if a round is an hour long, are you saying the half cap is at 30 minutes or a certain score?
So normally that time is going to be 30 minutes. They'll announce whatever the halftime cap is, but let's say that a round is an hour and there's a halftime cap at 30 minutes, and it's a game to 11. But let's say at the 30 minutes it's 4-3. So when that halftime cap comes on, you finish that point, and it's a tie game at 4. So you add 1 to the high score, it's both 4. So the instant a team scores 5, it's halftime. And then you do this. So instead of 6, which is what it would have been without the halftime cap.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Something else that, if you have any questions as to why there's no more win by 2, that's really just it's to limit the length of games. They're finding small ways to try to limit the length of games. It's to align it with WFDF, and just to simplify things. There was never, like, once a cap was on in the past, it was no longer win by 2, but there was often a common misconception that it was win by 2 under soft cap, but no. So here it's just you play to the score, no win by 2, and if the caps come on, you either add 1, or if a hard cap comes on, it's over unless it's tied. Okay. And so another rule that they've added they've changed, is when you call a timeout and you don't have one. Oh. We're on the same page, Dan. When you call a timeout and you don't have one, play stops briefly, and what happens is you add 3 seconds to the last stall count that was uttered. And if then that gets above 10, it's a turnover, but if it's below 10, it's not a turnover. So it kind of meets halfway between if there's a punishment or not for having it. And let me just make sure I did the play stoppage correctly. Okay, so play stops, you figure that out. If you said 5, then it comes in on 8. The reason I said you briefly stop play is because this isn't an opportunity for players to have a mini timeout, right? Where you might call a timeout, not have it, and then take that time to call a play. So play is supposed to stop. So you're supposed to, just like play normally stops, get everyone to stop in the field, get the stall count figured out, and restart play. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions about how that works? Great. One thing else I want to note that maybe some people know, maybe some people don't. After a timeout occurs, only the offensive team has to be stationary before it's tapped in. So if you're unsure about how that works, the defense doesn't have to be stationary, only the offense has to be. Yeah, okay. They've added some things in the injury timeout rules about if there is blood. If a player has blood, and you're supposed to call an injury. Even if you see someone else with blood, you call an injury. They have 70 seconds to cover up and clean up anything that has blood on it. So if they have an open wound, they have 70 seconds, or they have to leave the field. And the same thing, if something has blood on it, you have 70 seconds to take care of that, or it has to be removed from the field. This is a safety, not just a safety for the player with the open wound, but contamination issues, etc., for the other players. Now it just really specifies what it means when you see that and what you're supposed to do afterwards. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Oh, and they've also added an official procedure for how a spirit timeout works. So each team is supposed to have spirit captains, and a spirit captain's job is to check in with the spirit captain from the other team about spirit related issues. So you're supposed to check in about if you think the physicality is too much or not, if you think there's any issues with people following the rules or not. It's more about just making sure that if problems arise, that you check in and can make adjustments to them without it, coming to a head with big arguments or, really bad plays or something like that. So they're also, it's an opportunity for spirit captains to also say, like, we are focusing on this, or we're going to work on this. Can you let us know how we're doing with it? So it's a way to be able to get some feedback from your opponents about things that maybe you're trying to improve upon, during the game. So what happens is if a spirit timeout can be called by either spirit captain or both if they've talked about something and it hasn't changed, or something really, really, really egregious happens and you need to just cool people down. And it's supposed to remain, ideally it's supposed to last under 5 minutes. This is because most tournaments don't have a lot of extra time or space to spend a lot of time talking about this stuff. Whereas maybe in national championships or worlds, they might last longer. But the idea here is you're trying to give this is a way that you can figure things out officially without taking too long. As you can see, there's a long section about what it means to, what spirit captains are supposed to do in this situation, how spirit timeouts work. But it's basically just a way for everyone to take a step back, take a deep breath, get everybody on the same page when just the spirit captain's talking isn't enough, and then resume the game in a better manner. Does anyone have any questions or comments about the spirit timeouts?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
Are they going to make it mandatory to have a spirit captain then? Or do you know?
Most tournaments, there's no way for them to do that.
Okay.
Like, even if
I just thought maybe like a roster, like a roster designation or something.
I don't know, Christy, can you speak to that? With college this year, did there need to be an official spirit captain on your regular season tournaments? Do you know?
I didn't know about anything specifically. I'm not sure that we had one. I'm guessing that they would if like at any major like national level TCT events or nationals or but those you have to like turn in real rosters and things, so I'm not sure.
Yeah.
All right.
So, and even if they do, like, even if you're forced to put something online in practice, most tournaments, they're not going to be doing much. I think it's a good practice to have someone check in. And sometimes that could be like a regular captain, but it's kind of nice to have some, if your captains are more focused on strategy and team, et cetera, having someone else whose job it is to be able to touch base on this stuff is good internally, and it can be very good externally, because oftentimes, as like oftentimes the captains tend to be players who maybe play more and maybe into disagreements more, not because captains are disagreeable, but just because players who are better players and play more get involved in discussions a lot more. So that's not to say a spirit captain isn't a good player, but that's just I would say a good practice is for that. So to answer a question here, can spirit timeouts be called in the middle of points or just between? They can be called whenever they need to be. So often spirit timeouts actually happen during games where there's like maybe two players keep getting into it with each other, whether it's fouls or it could be like someone keeps calling a travel on someone, and like it needs to happen because you think that one of the players is going to like take a swing at somebody or something, right? It can happen maybe more likely in between points if you've just noticed things have built up and maybe a couple people have come to you on the sideline, but they can happen whenever they need to be. This is, in a way, I would say, kind of like dangerous play. It's in the safety of players. It supersedes kind of everything else if it needs to. You know, I would not, like, you know, you shouldn't walk onto the field saying, hey, spirit timeout while play is happening. But, you know, basically when play has paused or stopped, I think, you know, that's kind of when to do it. Ideally, you and the other spirit captain agree to it, but if you need to, you know, you can call it on your own if you're a spirit captain. Okay. Any other questions? Great. Let's see. Oh. So we're going to scroll down to offsides. So this is probably the biggest change in the rules. It gives a mechanism for teams to call off sides without observers, and what happens when offsides happens is significantly different now as well. So the way that you can call off sides if without observers is you have a designated sideline player go down to watch the team, both your team and the other team, to see if they're being offsides or not. And then you can call the team offsides, and what happens is if it's the pulling team that is offsides, then the offensive team can either take the pull as is, or they can take the disc at the brick mark. And let me double check. And the brick mark the first time, and then for subsequent times, they can take it at midfield. And then if it's the receiving team that's offsides, the team on offense, then the defense, they need to pause, and what happens is they can't start play until the defense taps it in like a timeout. So basically, if the receiving team is offsides, it just means the defense gets to set up on D, and if the defensive team is offsides, then the offensive team gets to move the disc up to either the brick mark or midfield, depending on when that happens. And if both teams are offsides, then what happens is the offensive team gets to set up wherever they would, whether it's the brick mark or midfield, as if the pulling team was offsides, but they can't put the disc into play until the defense is ready. So I know that's a lot right there. Does anyone have any questions on just where the disc gets put into play or how it can be put into play? Okay. And again, the way you call it is someone who's a sideline player is on the line, you know, on the sideline, at the line, watching if they're on or off sides. The only way you can contest in offsides is if you have a player also doing the same thing. So if team A has a sideline player next to team B's line and says they're offsides, team B can only contest if they have a sideline player looking in the same manner at the same place. So that's why you want somebody both on your side and the opponent's side. The opponent's side to be able to call them offsides if they're offsides, and your side to be able to contest. And if there are observers take control of this, just like it worked in the past, but this is a mechanism to do it without observers. Does anyone have any questions about that?
I have a question.
Yes.
So you're saying that you don't have to give like a warning, like, hey, we're noticing you're offsides. You can just decide to do this, set it up.
Yeah, I'm just double checking. Yeah, there's no like warning, right? The warning is just not for the quote unquote warning is if the defense is offsides the first time it goes to the brick mark. And after that, it goes to midfield for the offense. So that's kind of what the warning is. The warning is just it's brick mark instead of midfield. But there's no there's no warning or repull for the first time, kind of like there is now. It's just these rules apply right away.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, we got a question in the chat. I'm checking. So the continuation rule does not apply here. This is not a stoppage of play. So if somebody doesn't hear the offsides call and plays and there's a turnover or there's not, then play just continues. So if defense calls offsides and the offense throws it away, it's a turnover. Now, if defense calls offsides on the offense, but the offense completes a pass, that's when they can call the violation, because the violation isn't the offsides in itself. The violation is completing a pass before the defense is ready. Let me just double check. Yeah. So the disc is not in play, but it is a live disc. And what that means is it's a live disc, which means it's subject to a turnover. Does that answer your question fully, Dan? Okay. Anybody else have any questions about this?
What happens if one team contests the offside, but then the two players don't really get, they don't resolve it? Is it just a repull?
If it's a contested, it's a repull. But the only way it can be contested is if you have each team has a sideline player evaluating the line at the same place, or on either side or something. But if only one team does, the other team can't contest it. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Great. Let's go back to that changes doc. They've added a goal call. It's it's very there's not a lot of teeth in it. And by that I mean you don't have to call goal, but you can. And so it says, if a player catches the disc and believes a goal has been scored, the player may call goal and play stops. The best practice is lifting your arms above your head like so, but it's not required. And yeah, so I don't honestly know what the point of this is, why put it in halfway. One thing it definitely does not say is that to signify a goal, you tap the disc to the ground. So that's one of the things I just personally can't stand. But so it's a thing that basically means when it's called, it stops play, and anything that happens after it doesn't matter. And if you call goal, it goes back to when you first have possession. So let's say you call goal, let's say you catch it on a layout and roll, or you take 4 more steps, and for whatever reason, people have to reset, right? Maybe where you call goal, it's determined, that you weren't in or whatever. It's not when you called goal, it's where the goal would have occurred, or where the possession would have first occurred. Which is when you first catch it, as long as you didn't then bobble it again. Yeah, that's, any questions about that? Okay. They've now added 2 more types of disk space violations that they already existed, but now they have names that you can call instead of disk space if you'd like. They are straddle and wrapping. Straddle is if any 2 points of your body, most likely your feet, would intersect within a disc's diameter of the pivot. So it's kind of like the 2 lines of your body intersecting with the disc space of the torso. It now applies to the pivot. So you can still call disc space if that's happening, but it gives you the option to call straddle so that the player knows why you're calling it. And wrapping just is if any 2 points of your arms intersect with the torso. Even though it's still disc space violation if it intersects with the disc diameter. So wrapping just tells them why. Now, another thing with the rule is that it gives clarification on how to contest a disc space violation. Where is that? And it just says that here, if you contest it, you say violation. So let's say they say disc space and you disagree, you say violation. If they then make a throw that you think you could have had an impact on, but you were waiting to kind of like for a split second to figure out if you wanted to contest, you can bring the disc back because of that. So let's say I'm marking, the marker says wrapping, and I'm like, am I? And it can be quick, right? I don't get like 5 seconds to determine if I'm wrapping, but if I'm like, huh? And then I go violation, but then they've broken my mark, I can say violation, the disc has to come back because it affected the play. I didn't get a reasonable amount of time to determine if I was going to call violation or contest, call the violation in order to contest. So that's a situation where the call itself can affect the play, not just the act of, the call being the contest or the call of them making the call. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. And then there's something else I wanted to get back up here for for the delay of game rule, which is different than the pre-stall rule. The new rule for delay of game is if someone is unnecessarily delaying putting the disc into play, such as standing over it or kind of like not walking towards it and directing traffic, you're allowed to say delay of game and verbally count from 3 down to 0 with 1 second in between. And if they don't stop the delaying action, once you get to 0, you can start the stall count. If at any time within that 3 seconds they stop the delaying action, you can no longer keep that countdown. So if somebody is kind of standing away or no one's walking to the disc, you can say delay of game, 3, 2, but as soon as someone starts walking to the disc, it's no longer a delay of game. So that 3, 2, 1 isn't until they pick it up, it's just until they stop the delaying action. But if you get to 0 and start the stall count, then you can keep the stall count. It doesn't matter if they stop the delaying action after that point. Okay, does anybody have any questions about this?
I'm confused about that and pre-stall. So like, if they were, this is only for if they were intentionally not starting to walk to the disc, but when you could pre-stall if they were just taking a long time to get to the disc, like when would you use either one?
A pre-stall can start as soon as a turnover occurs. So if it's on the field, on the central, that was it's no longer the playing field proper. It's the central zone. If it's on the central zone, you get 10 seconds as soon as the turnover is over, and you can start that pre-stall and you don't have to stop it for any reason when it's on the playing field when it's on the central zone. When it's in the end zones or out of bounds, then that pre-stall is 20 seconds, except if the disc cannot be reasonably retrieved within 20 seconds. But once you start the pre-stalls, you don't need to stop for any reason unless it can't be reasonably retrieved within that time. And then once you get to 0, you just start counting. The difference here is technically teams are supposed to put the disc into play like as soon as they can. Like, they don't have to rush, but they just have to be moving towards putting into play. So what this says is, like, somebody has to be moving to try to put the disc into play. And if they're not doing it, they get 3 seconds to start doing that.
Got it.
Another thing that kind of applies to this, but also for other things, if there's no observers and the disc is like out of bounds, if a sideline player or another person picks up the disc to bring it back, the player who's putting the disc into play has to walk the disc to 3 yards outside of the sideline and then bring it back before they can bring it back to the sideline, tap it in, and continue playing. So it says non-playing members of the team on offense may assist in retrieving live discs outside the player and team lines. And if no lines exist in the out of bounds area. So technically other, spectators aren't supposed to, but it says non-playing members. And it says such players cannot cause a turnover. Once a player obtains possession of the disc, they must carry the disc to a spot outside the team line, which is 3 yards out. And if no such line exists, at least 3 yards away from the playing field before carrying it to the spot where it is to be put into play. So what that means is, like, think about those teams that line up the sideline on roller pools or whatnot and stop it. If that happens, then the player who's bringing it in has to take the disc 3 yards off the sideline before they bring it back to tap it in. So that prevents teams from rushing the disc in from what would naturally happen with if only people in the field could touch it. That is a new rule. I think that with observers, it's kind of been, they often only set it at the player line, but now it's codified in that, you can call a violation if another player stops the roll who's not on the field or picks it up and moves it, they can't toss it to someone and they tap it in. Any questions about that? Or the delay of game? Any more about that? Okay. This delay of game part used to be kind of hidden in the etiquette section, which was at the end of the rules. So if you're not familiar with this countdown, it used to be it used to be silent, and B, it used to be in the etiquette section. So now they've moved it into the main part of the rules. So with violations and fouls, they've made some changes about like how the continuation rule is worded, but it's still the same rule. They've explained how you deal with multiple infractions a little bit more. The main thing I'll say about that is you always determine the infractions in reverse order. So if you have a foul on the throw, a travel called, a pick that happens after the throw, and then a foul, you then start with that foul on the catch, and then you figure out what happens with that, and then you go to the pick and you figure out what happens with that, and then you keep working your way backwards. And then the other thing that they've really souped up a lot and changed is the dangerous play rule. So now the new rule for dangerous play is that basically the big change is that you can call a dangerous play without contact. It's not the exact same rule that happens at WFDF, but it's much closer to it than the previous rule. The previous rule used to be there used to need to be contact, and now there doesn't need to be contact. And basically what that means is, oh, did I skip it? Oh, shoot, I thought, did I not have it up? Sorry. Oh, there it is. Sorry. And so basically the way you could call a dangerous play without there being contact is if you are, very certain that, or reasonably certain that contact would have occurred, and you decided to move out of the way so that you didn't get hit by somebody, you can call a dangerous play. And, oh, wow. And they can contest if they think, oh, contact wouldn't have reasonably happened, or I changed direction after you moved and it would have avoided if you stayed there. So they can contest based on that, but now it gives the option to call it without needing to have contact. So it gives a little more ability to kind of protect yourself, or even your teammates, right? Like you can try, and whatnot. Yeah, so just a quick note on the time, it's 7:25. It was said that it would go to 7:30. I can stay and chat. Sorry I didn't have more time to open things up for general conversation about this. There are, a decent amount of substantial changes. Something else that the dangerous play rule gives is more examples. One thing that I do want to note on the examples is that it says that, where does it say? Running, the fourth bullet down, running without looking when there is a likelihood of other players occupying the space into which the player is traveling. So the reason that it specifies this is people often think that the offense inherently has a right to a space or is not responsible for dangerous plays. But every player on the field is equally responsible. And the general rule is the player with a better view has the better ability to avoid dangerous situations. But that doesn't mean that the offense or a player who's not looking isn't responsible. Sometimes it's saying that they are the ones who are responsible. A situation like this could be if a player is making a long up line cut, maybe 15 yards, and for 15 yards, they're looking backwards while running, they're looking over the shoulder while running the other direction. 15 yards is a long time for someone to run without watching where they're going. So what this allows is, let's say you're a player on the opposing team in a legal position, but this other player looks like they're going to truck you. You can jump out of the way and call a dangerous play there because they never, in 15 yards, they never looked up to where they were going. So that's a situation where often the offense might be at fault and you could avoid it while calling the dangerous play. It's just because someone cuts up line doesn't mean they own that space, but the flip side to that is if someone's cutting up line, you can't blindside them by running into the space at the last second where they can't avoid it. Yeah. So, I think that's the major change with the changes with the dangerous play, and that it gives these specific examples to help people avoid contact. It also says that reasonable, like we're trying to avoid contact in every way reasonably possible, because obviously we're playing a sport, contact will happen, injuries will happen. So, the only way to reasonably not have contact is to not play. So, it does make sure that, people recognize the risk that happens just by playing. Yeah. So before you go, let me mention again, if I didn't already, if you weren't here when I mentioned it earlier, Pittsburgh Ultimate, like any, Ultimate organization or sports league organization, doesn't have income coming in right now because the income comes from leagues. We would, if you are in a position, if you learned something from today, even if you didn't, but you're in a position to help out, please consider donating. I just, again, in the chat, put the information on how to donate. There's a link to the website. You can copy and paste. You can Venmo at PGH Ultimate. They're running a lot of great things, at least one thing a night. And more is in the works. So, I highly, if you are in the position to do that, please do that. And if you do need to go, something else I want to mention, we were given not only the okay, but the encouragement to boost our own things. I run trivia nights a couple times a week. Thursdays are general knowledge. Saturdays are themed. And this weekend, we're doing Harry Potter as a theme. If you're interested in that, you can contact me and I can get you on the list for the info. I also run private games. Yeah, but we can keep talking rules. I think those are the major. Yeah, the only other thing is they've changed some hand signals, but they've put hand signals, the misconduct system, the observers, and the changes of rules for youth and beach all into the official rules, whereas before they were just kind of in their own manuals. So you'll see that in the rules, the official rules. One other thing I do want to note for continuation. The two players can determine that the result of a play can stand if they've both determined that the call or infraction did not impact the play, even if the rules say the disc should come back. So this kind of goes hand in hand with only calling things that would affect the play. But, if you make a travel call and then the throw happens and determine, that didn't affect the play, even though the rules say the disc is supposed to come back, then you can both agree, the play stands. And that's actually one other rule, a big rule that changed. If you call a travel on somebody who hasn't thrown the disc, play does not stop. So the stall count stops. The player has to go back to where they need to put their pivot foot, tap the disc on the ground before they can throw it. And that's when you can restart the stall, or not restart, but resume the stall. You do not need to say stalling again. So if you said 1, travel, you just show them where they need to go. They tap back in, then you say 2. No one else needs to stop. Okay. That was a lot in an hour, but does anyone have any questions about anything, or general questions about rules or notes, or things that maybe I missed that you'd like to add?
I have a question, Ben.
Yeah.
So this isn't related to the new rules, but so sort of like a classic situation, you're standing in the stack and the defense initiates contact by sort of like putting their hand on you, or maybe just like a hand on your hip or an elbow just to see where you're going to go. Is that a foul?
Well, let's see here. It is the responsibility of all players. I'm trying to see where I can find the exact wording. It's the responsibility of all players to avoid contact. So it's a violation right there. Now their argument could be that's not affecting the play, but if you think it is, you can call that violation at the very least. That's one of those, unless I'm mistaken, that's kind of one of those things where some people argue it's not a foul, but it at the very least could be a violation if you believe it's affecting continued play. Does that answer your question well enough?
Yeah. I mean, it's just something that I've not felt comfortable calling and just haven't read up on. So I just wondered if that answers it.
I think
it happens all the time.
I think that brings up a very interesting thing about the difference between the letter of the rules and the spirit of the rules. So if you go back and kind of look at the history of the rules of Ultimate, especially as Ultimate became more competitive and not just some high school kids in New Jersey writing rules, it was much more important as the game evolved and progressed that the rules were more of a guide in order to just have the most fun while also having the most competitiveness that you can have. So this version of the rules kind of tries to get back to that more by focusing more on only call things in a consistent manner, only call things that really affected play. And the idea is that the beauty of it is players can figure out which of the rules are important for them to follow to the letter, and which they can, for lack of a better term, fudge a little bit more. Now, player safety comes before everything else. So you can't decide to be more dangerous. You're not supposed to be able to decide to mutually be more dangerous, right? But if both teams are okay, or specific players are okay with a little more physicality on defense, or starting with the hand on the hip more, that's one of those things where the idea is you can be technically breaking the rules, but if players are okay with it, you're actually playing within the rules, because that's the idea of a player-controlled sport. a player officiated doesn't just mean their job is to uphold everything as it's written. It means that they can determine what ones they want to call more and not. Another idea is if you notice that a player is doing that for 25 points and then only decide to call it on the 26th point because you thought like, oh, I can call it later if the game is close. It's saying that that's where that rule comes into place, that that it's supposed to be consistent. This doesn't mean that if you didn't realize it or it didn't affect you for 25 points and now it affects you, that you can't call it. But part of it is saying like, well, do you only think it affects you now because the game is close and you're heated? So that's kind of one of those things where, the idea is calling it consistent. If you think you're going to call it later, you should call it when you see it right away, or you should at least have a discussion about it so that it's not a surprise if it comes up.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Anything else? Okay. One other small note is it now officially says that after a stoppage of play, defenders and offenders can agree to slightly change positioning to avoid immediate picks. So if everyone involved agrees, you can say, oh, can I and player, a lot of times that happens already, but now it specifically says if people agree, you can be like, oh, I'll take one step this way, you take one step that way, and that way there's not a pick as soon as the disc is tapped in. Yeah. Christy, what's next? What's tomorrow?
Tomorrow is a session for women only that Amanda Erlinson and Molly Moore are running about creating an attacking space on offense, which is cool. We haven't done a women only space, but we wanted to create some safer spaces for women. And Wednesday is yoga with Chris Lippert, which has been a hit. Yeah, we have a lot of stuff coming up. I just put beatboxing on the schedule for next Thursday. Pretty cool.
And if you have been unaware of all the things that are happening, Christy's doing a great job and a lot of volunteers are doing a great job planning these things and getting programming out there. I also want to give a shout out to the Bay Area Disc Alliance. Is that Alliance? We're using their Zoom account, so we're very grateful to be able to kind of piggyback on their business Zoom account, which allows a lot more access. So if you know them, say thanks to them as well. Yeah, a lot of good work here. Go vote for the best cat and best dog. Thanks, Christy and Duffy on that one.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah. So, yeah.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks,
We'll do this.
Thanks,
We'll
Ben.
do this again before they change the rules, which will be before we get to play Ultimate again. So you'll be set.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Chrissy. Have a good night.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben.
Mm-hmm. Good seeing you.
Good to see
Christy, it took me forever to realize CJL was you. In the chat. Yeah. I was like, well, who's CJL? And then I looked at your screen. No. I was like, but the ultimate comment, I was like, is Nern on? And then I was like, oh, that's not. But then it made sense when you were like the joke, you saying it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
also, you can turn off the recording if you want.
Oh yeah. Oh, I forgot to say we were recording. Fuck.
Well, it has a notification to everybody, so they should know.